welcome back to my channel. I'm Robin, or A Hobbit's Reading List, and today we're going to talk about all the books that I read in the last third of 2023. In September, or I guess like in October is more realistic, I kind of fell off with my monthly wrap-ups. Don't really have a reason. I think I was just really busy between like work and school and, you know, preparing for the holidays, and so any time that I was supposed to do it, you know, towards the end of the month, it just didn't come up on my to-do list. For anyone who watches my vlogs, you'll know that like I generally randomize pretty much everything, either by like asking Siri to pick something like off a list or put it in a spinning wheel. And so I've been doing that for like a year, and just for whatever reason, filming a wrap-up just didn't come up at like the appropriate times, or it came up at a time where like I couldn't do it. So here we are. So we're going to talk about the 34 books that I read in the last third of 2023. I'm not going to make this like super detailed. To me, 34 books is a lot to talk about, so I'm going to tell you the book, I'm going to tell you my impressions of where I am currently with them. I'm not going to do ratings or anything, so you're just going to take away like my general vibes about the books. So starting with September, I read 6 books in September, and I'm just going to go in order. So I read The Grey Album, which is pretty much explaining different aspects of American Black culture. I read this for one of my classes last semester, and it was really interesting. It was really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot from it. I just feel like at the time that I read it, I had a week to read 400 pages of nonfiction, which like I don't read nonfiction a ton. I read it much slower than I do, you know, fiction, and so what I remember from it is just feeling like very stressed out, because I'm like, all right, I have to read all of this for class and like take notes on it so I can talk about it in class, but I only have a week. And so I remember like looking back on it, like I did learn a lot, especially about like music and literature within Black communities, but it's tinged with this like stress. So if you're gonna pick up Grey Album, which I do recommend actually, just, you know, take your time. Take your time. I then read The Hermaphrodite, which I read for a different class, and it is about this person who is born intersex, but because it is set in the 1850s, it was also written around the 1850s, this person's parents decide to raise him as male. And so he uses he, him pronouns, and he doesn't really struggle with being intersex until like I think like early 20s, and then he has a series of events that really like call into question like who he is and his faith and his relationships, and it was really interesting. I don't know, I probably wouldn't read it again. Quite frankly, it's kind of depressing, and it also wasn't finished, which is not my favorite, but I understand. So there's that. I also, in September, I was listening to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and so in September I finished the audiobook for The Two Towers. I'm a huge Tolkien fan. Obviously, Hobbit is in my name for my YouTube channel, and so I love Lord of the Rings. Two Towers is great. The narration by Andy Serkis was phenomenal. Definitely recommend it. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about that one. And then I read Citizen, which is a book of, I guess, technically poems. And I read this for my ethnic and racial identities class. And I thought it was really powerful. And it's such a quick read, too. Like, I thought it was really interesting. And it brought up things that I'd never considered before, and it still stuck with me. I think it's actually like on my desk because I like looked over it the other day. And so I definitely check that out, especially if you're somewhat new to poetry. Like it's not standard poetry. It's doesn't have a lot of rhymes, and some of them are more like essays, but I thought it was amazing, and I definitely want to get another book by that author. I then also finished listening to The Return of the King, so that wrapped up the trilogy for me, which I was really glad to listen to. And same thing, it was narrated by Andy Serkis. It was very well done. Return of the King is probably my least favorite book, which isn't saying much. Like, I did, like, rank the trilogy, and the first two got 5 stars, and I think Return of the King got 4.5. And it's just because I don't agree with the Scouring of the Shire at the end of the book. I just don't agree with that subplot being thrown in there. So, but that's the only thing. Otherwise, perfect. And then at the end of September, I read John Henry Days for my ethnic and racial identities class. September was me figuring out how to be a student again and how to be a literature student, because I've never done that before. So that's why pretty much all my books, except for the audiobooks, were for class. John Henry Days I thought was really interesting. It's about this, it has a dual timeline. It's about John Henry, who is a character in folklore. He, I believe, used to be a slave, and then he was a railroad worker after the Civil War, and the folklore goes that he was someone who, like, nailed the spikes into the railroad, I believe, and so he went up against the machine that was gonna, like, take over that job, and he won, and then he died. So that's the folklore. And then the book is about this, like, festival that is celebrating John Henry, and the post office, like, developing a stamp of different, like, folklore characters, and John Henry is one of them. So it was really interesting. There's a lot of discussion about race, especially because it was set in the South, and one of the main characters is black, and just sort of, like, look around and be like, oh, okay, like, just feeling kind of uncomfortable. So it was really interesting. I remember a lot of good discussions in class, and the only thing I believe that I didn't like was that the ending was fairly ambiguous, but I understand why, so I would still recommend it. Okay, so in October, I did better. I think I had less class books to read, and in October, I think I was sick. October was when I was sick for like 4 days. I completely lost my voice, and so I did read during that, but obviously my vlog for that week is just non-existent. So the books that I read in October, Parallel Sower was for my class. It's a I read the graphic novel version. I know that there's also the original novel version. The graphic novel just, like, intensifies pretty much everything. That one had a lot of great discussion points as well, especially about, like, what happens racially at the end of the world. Like, are people still separated based off the color of skin? Is that something we still struggle with, especially in America? And I thought that was really interesting. So, and it's a pretty quick read. Like I said, it's a graphic novel, so you get through it pretty quick. And then I read Thistlefoot. I believe I listened to the audiobook version of it. I did really like it. I thought it did a really interesting job exploring, like, generational trauma and how that carries through, because it also pulled in folklore of talking about, like, Baba Yaga and possible backstory for that, and I thought it was just really interesting, like, blending, and there's some, like, magical elements. I thought it was just a really, like, clever way to sort of examine a lot of different aspects of storytelling. So yeah, I thought it was really cool. I might reread it in the future. And then I read Carry On Jeeves. So I read that for the podcast that I do with my dad. Carry On Jeeves is a short story collection, I believe. Yeah. It's one of those things of, like, yeah, because I haven't read any novels of Jeeves yet. So I like Jeeves and Wooster. I think it's funny, so I liked reading the short stories. Read them for a laugh, you know. Then Then I read The Orphan Keeper. So I actually DNF'd this book at like 60% because I just couldn't take it anymore. I remember the writing wasn't super great, and I just have an issue because it was a white person telling a story based off of the true events that happened to a person of color, and I couldn't find anything that showed that like the person of color got any like cut of profit or anything like that, and so it just made me uncomfortable. And plus, like, the writing wasn't like good, the storytelling wasn't good, a lot of it didn't actually like make sense, and so I just hit a point where I'm like, nope. And it was for my family book club, and I had to go to the meeting like, yeah, no, I couldn't. So take that, you know, with a grain of salt, I guess. I also finished Little Women, which was for one of my classes. I never read Little Women before. I really enjoyed it, actually. I thought it brought up a lot of interesting questions, especially because I read it for a gender class, and, you know, it sort of examines like what different aspects of womanhood did each of the sisters represent, and reading the criticism that has come out about Little Women, you know, ever since it was published pretty much, and like different people's interpretations, was just really interesting. So Little Women is the story of the 4 March sisters, and just the things that they go through over a span of like, I don't even know, 4 years? See, it doesn't seem like very long, but I know there's a 2-year gap. So, you know, if you're looking for classics, honestly, I think that's probably one of the easiest classics to get into. I also listened to Spellbound, which is a YA book about this guy named Rook, who, his grandmother was magical, but when she died, he wasn't allowed to like still participate in the magical world because he didn't actually have magic. And so he's figured out a way to get into the magical world, even though he shouldn't be according to the rules. And he ends up meeting this person that he finds really interesting. And they are both like apprentices to learn magic. And they have to like team up together to like rescue their mentors. And I remember thinking, I was like, yeah, this is, like, it's cute and it's fun, and like part of it's were funny, but then there were other parts where I'm just like, I remember thinking as I was listening to it, I'm like, oh, it would be really interesting if the author did this. Like, that would make it like really exciting and sort of like tie up some loose ends, and that didn't happen, and I remember being disappointed because I'm like, oh, I felt like that would have been better. So yeah, there's that. I then read Jew of New York for a class. Jew of New York is confusing. Like, I honestly can't really tell you what it's about. It's a graphic novel. There are I think there are like 5 different storylines all sort of like interweaving, which is usually fine, but just, you never know when you turn the page, you never know what storyline is going to be on the next page. And so it's just, I honestly can't tell you much about it. Like, to me, it's just very, very confusing. So I won't be reading it again. I reread A Marvellous Light, which is the first book in the Last Binding series, and it's one of my favorite series. It's fantasy set in an alternate Edwardian time. It's queer. It's honestly, like, it has everything that I want. A Marvellous Light is really, really good. And the last book in the series was coming out in November, and so I wanted to reread the first 2 books, which I did. After that, I listened to A Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. I remember really liking the main character, the vicar, and I thought the whodunit aspect was interesting up until, you know, it was confirmed, like, who the killer was, and I was like, oh. And I also remember not really liking Miss Marple. I hadn't read a Miss Marple novel before, and I was expecting to be more like Poirot, and it wasn't. And so I think I may have to read another Miss Marple just so that I don't have that expectation, so maybe I'll like it better. But from what I saw of Miss Marple, I didn't really like her. And then I reread A Restless Truth, which is the second book in the Last Binding series. Still loved it. Still thought it was really well done. And then I actually, towards the end of the month, there was actually a book signing by Freya Marske, who's the author of the Last Binding series. And so I was able to go to that and actually get the last book, A Power Unbound, about like 9 days earlier than, than I would have, because I had pre-ordered it. And so as soon as I finished A Restless Truth, I was able to immediately just jump into A Power Unbound. And so I read that, and that was obviously the last book of the trilogy, so I can't really tell you too much about it. But each book in the trilogy follows a different couple within the plot. And I love the couple that was in the last book. I thought they were like awesome. And it was really well done, and I can't wait to read more by Freya Marske, honestly. She's very talented. That's October. Okay, I'm trying to like make this quick, because I don't want to, you know, and I'm like, honestly, this room is very hot. I feel like I'm kind of just like sweating. So for November, I read 7 books, and yeah, I'm looking at it now, I'm like, it's very up and down kind of month. I started with Frozen Assets, which is a P.G. Wodehouse book, and it's one of his standalone novels. I'm trying to remember, I'm like, it's about this guy who has his like account frozen as long as he like doesn't get arrested, and so his sister and his friend are trying to keep him from being arrested because he has a tendency to get arrested, I believe. And then there's other characters coming in who sort of cause some trouble. There's a whole, I remember a whole great scene about pants, which I know doesn't give you a lot of information, but it was really funny. Yeah, I remember liking Frozen Assets for the most part. I think I probably gave it like a 4-star or something. I might be wrong, but I think especially compared to the 3 Wodehouse novels that I read after this book, this one is definitely like top of the books that I read in the last third, as far as Wodehouse goes. And then I read Angels in America for class, which is a play about a lot of different like marginalized communities in the 90s during the AIDS epidemic. There's a lot of like overlap. There's a lot of like queer and Jewish and black and Mormon and and there's a lot of different characters. They all interact, and it's really interesting. It kind of stuck with me for a bit, and there were a lot of like interesting conversations with that one as well. So I definitely recommend reading it. And I know there's also, I watched the first 2 episodes of the like, I believe it's HBO series from the like early 2000s, which honestly is pretty well done and also very faithful to the play. So after that, I listened to Emma, continuing my quest to read all the Jane Austen books. And I remember liking Emma. I do this thing though where listening to Jane Austen makes me want to watch like adaptations of it, and so I did watch the 2020 version of Emma, and so I got spoiled, which like doesn't mind, I don't care, because in a lot of ways it makes me want to continue reading the book, see what really happened in the book. But the movie made a bigger deal out of a certain scene, whereas in the book it was just like, oh, this happened, and like, yeah, you shouldn't have done that, but like whatever. And so yeah, it was just like, I prefer the book version, honestly. I feel like it makes more sense with a lot of things. But I did enjoy it, you know, it was funny. There was a lot of miscommunication, which I love as a plot device. So yeah, I thought it was good. I'll probably reread it. I do want a nicer copy because mine is kind of, you know, beaten up a little bit. Then I listened to The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I liked the part about Evelyn's story. It has a dual timeline. It's set, you know, following Evelyn's like growth as an actress and the different relationships she entered into and sort of that. But then it also has a timeline like present day of older Evelyn telling this story to, what's her name? Monique, I think? To a journalist, to like, it's a tell-all. And I didn't like the present day aspects. I'm like, I don't need that. Like, just focus on the past. Just tell the story. So yeah, it was okay. It's okay. Leave It to Smith, I did not like. I don't like Smith as a character. He's a Wodehouse character. I don't like him. And so I don't like really any book that he's in. And Leave It to Smith, I was really hoping I would enjoy it more than previous Smith novels because it is set in Blanding's Castle, which is a different series of Wodehouse, but there's some overlap there. And I like Blanding's Castle, so I hoped that would overshadow how much I dislike Smith, and unfortunately it didn't. So if you like Smith, that's awesome. Read Leave It to Smith. I think there are certainly funny aspects to it, so you'll probably enjoy it, but I'm just someone that like that kind of ruined it for me. I then read the Yiddish Policeman's Union, which sort of takes a look at what if America had given land in Alaska to Jewish people to settle after, or before, during, and after World War II, to have, you know, their sort of own area, which brings up a whole other, you know, set of issues because there are indigenous people to that land, and is it America's, you know, right to give that to other people to inhabit? And there's also a murder mystery within that as well. So like there's the central plot of the murder mystery and trying to figure that out, but there's also these different aspects of how the Jewish people who had settled here interacted with the Native Americans who were already there, and what happened there, and yeah, it was just really interesting. Again, brought up a lot of really interesting discussion, and I actually did enjoy it. I will say that. I actually recommended it to the Temple Book Club that I lead, and so we had a lot of great discussions about that as well. So yeah, I do recommend that one actually. And then finally in November, I listened to Hidden Huntress, which is the second book in the Malediction trilogy, which is a young adult story about this girl, Cecile, who is kidnapped and taken underneath, the Forsaken Mountain. I love the names for mountains in fantasy novels. They're always like very on the nose. Where she discovers that trolls are actually kept under the mountain. They're trapped by a curse, and it is a prophecy that she will help free them. And so that is talked about a lot in the first book. Second book is a continuation of that. It's very interesting. And I remember listening to it and having sort of the same thought that I did with Spellbound of like, oh, it'd be interesting if the author did this. And she did it. And I was like, yes, because that makes the most sense. So I actually really, really enjoyed it. So for December, around mid-December, I decided I was going to try to get to 100 books by the end of the year because I was already at like 94 or something. So there was no reason that I shouldn't. So I read 11 books in December. This was also helped due to the fact that I traveled down to my dad's house for Christmas and I drove, so I had 2 12-hour journeys to listen to an audiobook, so that really helped as well. But I started the month by reading Amphigory, which is a collection of... It's not a graphic novel. I'd say it's like a collection of short graphic novellas, maybe? They're like 15 different like short stories, but there's an art element to it. They're all very like macabre. But some of them are honestly like kind of amusing. It's just really interesting, and I think if you've been told you have a twisted or dry or dark sense of humor, maybe check out Edward Gorey's art. And then I read Fires in the Mirror, which was the last book that I read for one of my classes. It is a play that is about the riots in Crown Heights, I believe, in Brooklyn, I believe in 1993, that happened between the Jewish community in this neighborhood and the black community in this neighborhood. And so it was, I knew about, you know, this, I don't want to say riot, because there wasn't a ton of rioting, I don't believe. I was barely alive at that time. But the play is a one-woman show, technically, where the playwright acts out these different people that she did interview and their different perspectives of what had happened in the neighborhood and everything. So it was interesting. There was a lot of interesting discussions where people had a lot of opinions, and that's great. But I feel like that those discussions that I had sort of tainted what I took away from the play, which I already didn't. I took a lot away from the play, and it's something that I still think about. I don't think I'll read it again because it was upsetting. So, and I don't read a lot of upsetting things. Like, I read to escape, not to, you know, think about, like, the real world, like, implications of different... I read to escape. I don't read to think more about the world, and that's hilarious considering I'm going for a literature degree, which is all I do. I didn't think that through. Anyway, after that, I listened to A Shot in the Dark, which is about, what was it, a photography program. A woman who used to be part of the Hasidic community. She left for a particular reason, which is a spoiler, so I'm not going to say. She started drinking, she got addicted, and then she got sober. She, you know, found her love of photography again. She goes to this graduate program where she can study under her role model. But the day before classes, she goes to this, like, gay bar, and she, you know, hits it off with someone, they start hooking up, and the next day she discovers that the person she hooked up with is her role model. And so it just goes through, like, how they decide to handle that. I remember, like, actually really enjoying it. I really enjoyed the aspects of Judaism that were in it. I feel like I learned a lot, and I thought about a lot. So I did enjoy it. I just had, like, some issues with the love interest, but, like, it was still pretty good. I then read Mr. Jingle Bells. I was trying to read holiday stuff because it was, you know, around the holidays. Mr. Jingle Bells is about I want to say enemies. It's more like a grumpy sunshine and a, oh, I thought you didn't like me kind of thing, where there's this guy who's very much like a dude. You know, he's bi, but he presents as very, like, people who look at him are like, oh, he's straight. Which isn't fair. But he is attracted to one of his business partners who's a little more flamboyant. But they don't really interact much because of reasons. But they end up having to... He invites the more flamboyant character to stay with him while the other one's apartment is getting, like, fumigated or something. And so they start discovering more about each other and liking each other, and there's a whole, like, fake boyfriend plot, and honestly it was a lot of fun. I might reread it next year because I really enjoyed it. I then listened to The Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels. This was not a seasonally appropriate book. Most of it took place over summer, but I did enjoy it. I really liked the main character. I really love Regency, like, let's say 1800s to 1920s. any book set in that era, I'm pretty much down for. I really like the main character. She was very... this one was Victorian, now that I think about it, because Queen Victoria actually does show up there. It was funny. It was really funny. It was enjoyable. I just feel like it should have focused more on the romance instead of... It sort of treated, like, the romance and this other plot as, like, equal. It shouldn't have. It should have... it should have done this, because this is what it ended up as. Like, it started here, but it ended up as this. And so it was really, like, this plot over here was really dissatisfying because it was just, like, resolved like that. So I probably would reread it, but probably just skip over that, like, subplot because it just wasn't important. And then we're getting to the point of the year where I started driving down to see my dad, and so I listened to You're a Mean One, Matthew Prince, which I thought was really, I actually really enjoyed it. You know, it was a little predictable as for like what was supposed to be the big twist, but I did enjoy it. So You're a Mean One, Matthew Prince is about this guy, Matthew. He is from a well-off family, and he causes a situation that brings some bad like PR, or could bring some bad PR down on his family. And so they sort of take him out of the limelight, send him to his grandparents in this like small town in, is it Massachusetts? I don't think it's Massachusetts, but it's somewhere in New England. It's within driving distance of New York. And with his grandparents, they're having this guy named Hector, who is one of Matthew's grandfather's students at the like local college. He's staying with them and sort of like helping out with stuff, and so they actually have to like share a room. They have to share bunk beds actually, so it's not quite one bed, but it's amusingly close. And they're very different people, but they end up, you know, getting close to one another and liking one another. You know, it's a romance. It was fun. Had some nice holiday like tropes and cliches, which I really appreciate. The, you know, big twist at the end was, I saw it coming. Like as soon as it started, I'm like, oh, okay. But I didn't have an issue with that, honestly. Like I thought it was still really well done, and I enjoyed it. So if you're looking for a holiday story, there you go. I then read Bells Are Ringing, which is a novella set after the events of We Could Be So Good by Cat Sebastian. Cat Sebastian releases like a holiday epilogue to one of her stories every holiday season. This year was luckily We Could Be So Good, which I read in August, and I loved. I gave it 5 stars. So Bells Are Ringing, 40-ish pages, and I liked it. I thought it was cute. I thought it was fluffy. It was exactly what I wanted to read, you know, right before Christmas. So, yay. While I was at my dad's, I had to read The Little Nugget by P.G. Wodehouse. At its core, there's nothing wrong with this story. To me, it was a slog, and I remember realizing why, but I've now forgotten. It just, I don't know. I really can't explain it now. When we recorded the podcast for it, I was like, oh, and this. Oh, and this. Like, I made a couple different realizations of why I didn't like it much, but I can't remember any of them now. It just didn't click for me. Not as much as other Wodehouse novels have. I then listened to, on my way home, I listened to Smart Women by Judy Blume. I remember thinking that this book was very dated. Usually I don't have an issue listening to books that were published before I was born, you know, whatever the time period, or even set in a time before I was born. But, I don't know, Smart Women, just maybe it was the fact that it was, you know, the setting was like, I think it's 79, it was published in like 83, and like maybe that was just too close to where I expected the characters to be more. It felt very dated. Like, I don't know the word that I want to use. I was expecting the characters to be more. I was expecting the story to be more. And so it was disappointing. I didn't really like any of the characters. And yeah. I then, once I got home, I'm like, okay, I have like 4 days. I need to read 2 books. So I read Wide Sargasso Sea, which is inspired by a character from Jane Eyre and giving some more backstory for that. That's all I can really say without giving spoilers for either books. So I then listened to Lady Susan, which is about 2.5 hours, and it's by Jane Austen. It is a series of letters from Lady Susan and the people around her talking about Lady Susan, who is this like manipulative, I don't want to say vindictive, but she's manipulative. She's trying to get her claws in like this like handsome, wealthy, somewhat naive person, because she's also a widow, but no one really likes her, except for like her one friend that she writes letters to. And so it's just like everyone operating around that and trying to like keep them apart and dealing with it. I really liked it. Unfortunately, it's not finished, so the last like 15 minutes of it was the narrator saying like, this is how the story resolved, but we don't have like the actual meat of it. But I did really enjoy it. I probably like glance through it again. So there you go. That's the last third of the year. The last like what, 34 books that I read. And whew, yeah, hopefully I won't go another 4 months without doing a wrap up, because I do like being able to give you a little bit more, but I think I did a decent job summing up how I felt about the books. So yeah, leave a comment if you read any of these books. I love interacting with you guys, talking about them. You know, give me any recommendations based off of what I've said about these books. I think it gives you a pretty good idea of what books I like, what I look for. Like the video, subscribe, click notification bell, and make sure to keep an eye out for my vlogs, because that way you get real-time opinions. And I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye!